Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, January 10th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the strategy that I believe the Democratic Party should take moving forward, entering into the 2024 election, 2028 election, and also midterm elections as well. This is something that could be very beneficial in down ballot races as well as on the presidential level, so we're going to talk about it and why I believe that this should be a policy or a strategy implemented by national Democrats, because it's something that could be a very easy way to win future elections for the Democratic Party. Now, what we've seen this election season is that Joe Biden's main strategy was focusing on the Rust Belt, focusing on the Clinton states from the 2016 election. While he was able to flip Arizona and Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were the states that the Democratic Party really were super surprised to lose in 2016. Now, looking at the map, these states were all pretty close, and yes, you should see that you should expect the Democratic Party to try to retain those states because they are very large in terms of their electoral weight, but moving past this point, I think the main focus should not be on the Rust Belt specifically, but more so on the Sun Belt region of the United States. You see, this election was sort of a breaking point for the entire Sun Belt region because this was the first time where the Democratic Party actually made inroads in terms of actually winning a singular state across the Sun Belt besides the standard. You know, Georgia and Arizona were states that were out of reach for the Democratic Party in 2008 and 2012 when Obama was running for the first time, and the second time we didn't even consider Georgia or Arizona to be swing states. And then 2016 rolls around and they surprise us by how close they actually got, and then 2020 they flip to the Democratic side. Georgia swinging 6 points, Arizona swinging 4 points. So, looking into the future, the Democratic Party could target these Sun Belt states and win elections based purely on Sun Belt support and solid Democratic support. The Democratic Party would no longer need the Rust Belt in order to win future elections. And the demographic shifts are telling us that this is the road the Democratic Party should be taken. Now, they should not neglect the voters of the Rust Belt by any means. They still need them for the next few elections, but moving past around 2030, it's going to be much easier for Democrats to win in the Sun Belt, and if they don't tap into that, well, it'll pretty much be their fault. The Republican Party took for granted their 20 years of victories in Arizona and Georgia, and they paid the price for this election. The Democratic Party needs to be proactive and actually dedicate millions of dollars of resources into a number of these states in order to win in future elections. So why the Sun Belt? Well, what you're looking at across this region is an area where the Democratic Party did not do too well in the past. In 2004, this was actually one of the best displays of support for a Republican candidate across the entire Sun Belt region. Georgia was won by 17 points. Arizona was won by 11 points. Texas was won by 23 points. This entire region was very solid for the Republican Party. Now, I know what you're surprised to see, that Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana were all likely states. West Virginia was likely as well. Tennessee was likely as well. But this is just because, only 8 years prior, these states were pretty solid for the Democrats. Arkansas was plus 17, Louisiana was plus 12, Missouri was plus 6, West Virginia was plus 15. So it would make sense that these states were competitive. But obviously, as they got closer through the regular election, up into our 2016 onwards type of history, they started getting more Republican. But some states actually shifted in a very opposite direction. So we actually can use this to compare previous elections. We can compare the 2012, actually, I don't know if I did this correctly. Let me go ahead and just refresh the page really briefly. But we can compare previous elections on this map. We can compare 2020 to 2016. And you will notice that Georgia, Texas, and Arizona, pretty much the actually major parts of the Sun Belt besides Florida, actually shifted in favor of the Democratic Party. Well, that's expected. Joe Biden won the election, Hillary Clinton did it, but let's go back to 2012. Well, there are some regions where the Democratic Party didn't do that much better in, Mississippi most notably, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, Florida, but the Democrats improved in North Carolina. They improved in Georgia by a whopping 8 points against America's first black president. You would expect, and he did actually drive up turnout to a point where in 2012, black turnout exceeded white turnout in terms of raw percentage, so I think that's pretty substantial. But Georgia this year swung 8.1% relative to 2012. Arizona swung 9.4% relative to 2012. Texas swung by 10.3% relative to 2012. But let's skip Obama. Let's go back to the previous Republican who won before Trump. Well, in 2004, if we compare it from 2020 to 2004, some regions of the country do shift to the right. But in the Sunbelt region, you will notice, yes, there are some of those standard states, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Oklahoma, the states that we don't really need to discuss because they're not going to be competitive for Democrats in future elections, maybe Mississippi in 10, 20, 30 years, but for right now, we're not going to be focusing too heavily on those. We're talking about regions of this entire region that holds a number of swing states. Colorado shifts by 18 points from 2004 to 2020. New Mexico by 12. Arizona by 11. Texas by 17.4. Georgia by 17. North Carolina by 11. So these states swing by a very considerable amount from 2004 to 2020. And as the elections continue to stagger on, these states continue to show us that they have swung from every previous election up until this point in favor of the Democratic Party. There's actually a region of the country that actually has had the opposite effect, and that is the Rust Belt region. Since Obama's 2008 election performance, just comparing 2012 versus 2008, the entire country shifted to the right. But it just wasn't enough in order to give Mitt Romney the victory here. Well, if we should compare 2008 to 2016, you will see super large shifts. Michigan swings by 17 points, just 8 years in difference. Indiana by 20 points. Iowa by 19 points. Super significant shifts. But Texas, Arizona, and Georgia remain constant. But we can actually see, from 2012 to 2016, Obama's victory versus Clinton's victory, well, pretty significant shifts. Comparing it to 2020, there are some areas where Biden did better, but the Rust Belt region's still moving away. But 2016 to 2020 obviously was a better year for Joe Biden because this was a year where you had one winning candidate in 2020 and a losing candidate in 2016. But comparing, the previous winning Democrat, when Biden was actually coincidentally on the ticket, Obama to Biden, there are some blue spots usually, in the Sun Belt region, and then a redder part of the entire Rust Belt, of the entire, I guess you could say, this 1/4 of the United States, with a few exceptions in the Northeast. So why do I think that the Democratic Party should target these Sun Belt states? Well, just looking back at the history at some of these states, looking back at Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, Arizona, these are all states that were immediately counted out by Democrats for decades. Texas hasn't gone to a Democrat since 1976. 1976 was the last time a Democrat won in Texas. Well, prior to Joe Biden, Georgia had been last won by a Democrat in 1992. I wasn't even born when Georgia had gone blue. Same thing with Arizona. Last time Arizona went blue was in 1996. And it's not just these two states that are changing. Texas is changing tides as well. In 2012, this was a safe state, won by Romney by 16 points. Even though Trump shifted the entire nation to the right, there were few exceptions. Arizona, Georgia, and Texas were 3 of them. Texas went to Trump by 9 points. This year, even with increased Hispanic support, which was actually pretty considerable in some states, not so much in others, but overall increased support for Donald Trump amongst Hispanic voters, huge demographic group in Texas, might I add, Texas only went to Trump by 5.5%. I know that may seem like a lot given Joe Biden's narrow victories in some of these states, but the fact Minnesota went for Biden more than Texas is alarming for the GOP. The fact that Texas was closer than Virginia, New Hampshire, Colorado, New Mexico should be alarming for the GOP. Closer than Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. I mean, Trump won Nebraska's 2nd in 2016. A lot of these states and districts shifted by a very similar amount, but the fact that Texas swung by nearly 4 points from 2016 to now is worth noting, because election after election, the Republican Party's grip on the Sun Belt region has loosened. It went from a point where the Republican Party was winning in Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and Virginia. Obama changed that. It went from a point where the Republican Party was winning, obliterating Democrats in Arizona and Georgia. Biden changed that. Looking ahead to future elections, Texas could become another one of those states. And Florida is by no means 100% out of reach for Democrats. This 3.3% victory is simply that, a 3.3% victory. People don't discount Texas being a swing state, but for some reason, because Florida has had a streak of Republican victories, people think that it's no longer competitive for the Democratic Party. Florida is by no means as partisan as Georgia was, and Georgia took 2 decades to get there, but it still got there. The Democratic Party was still eventually able to get it. The Democrats may be at a point where they aren't doing super well in Florida, but they should start treating it with a lot more, careful intention than they do currently. Their candidates sometimes don't even try to appeal to Hispanic voters. And there's a reason why Donald Trump did much better amongst Hispanic voters, specifically in Florida. Look at Miami-Dade County, shifting by nearly 30 points from 2016, one of the most populous counties in the entire state. Democrats should be dissecting what went wrong there and not completely giving up Florida. Because a very real scenario in future elections could be a point where, Joe Biden, or any Democrat really, is able to rely solely on solid Democratic support. We're talking about states that were, we're talking about states that were very solid for the Democratic Party. So we're not talking about the Rust Belt. Forget the Rust Belt for just a moment, right? Let's take all of these safe states and all of these states that are going to be likely for the Democratic Party, or at least were likely in this election. You can see that the Democratic Party can win the election based off of these Sun Belt voters alone. They are able to tap into the states that were likely, and if they're able to win some of these voters, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, on top of all the Clinton states from 2016, including Nebraska's 2nd district, and just for the sake of this, I can actually take this out, take Nebraska's 2nd in Biden's column out. Just 3 states would put the Democrats over the top. If we include Texas, you include Arizona, you see how much worse it gets for the GOP, because just with the Sun Belt support, the Democrats are able to reach 331, larger than Trump or Biden's victory, near maxing out to the 2012 presidential victory without the Rust Belt, without an ounce of support in Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. The strategy for Democrats winning elections in the future remains in the Rust Belt, at least in my opinion, not in the Rust Belt, in the Sun Belt, at least in my opinion. They can obviously still focus a lot of money on the Rust Belt, because if they win that too, well, the map gets much better for the Democratic Party. But also, when I'm looking at the significant shifts in some of these states, the Rust Belt has only gotten redder and the Sun Belt has gotten bluer. And obviously there are some notable exceptions in the more solid Republican states, but I'm not talking about those really. We're not going to be seeing the Democratic Party try to win Tennessee on the presidential level just because it doesn't seem too likely to happen in the future. But Texas does seem likely. North Carolina does seem likely. Florida does seem likely. The Democrats have already been able to win Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Georgia, Virginia, all 6 of which were Bush states back in 2004, 4 of which were Obama states in 2008, 2012, Clinton states in 2016. Those states began to be, somewhat locked down. Nevada's the closest one out of them all. And then they add Arizona and Georgia. Well, what's next? North Carolina, Florida, Texas. These are all states that are winnable for Democrats, and they should be focusing on them in the future, because these states are also increasing in population. I don't know if this actually has the 2024 map. It does not have the 2024 map, but if you're looking at the 2024 election projections, well, you will notice that Texas is set to gain 3 electoral votes, which only incentivizes Democrats to focus there as well. Arizona and Colorado are set to gain 1 electoral vote, a net gain of 2 for the Democrats in terms of overall support from the 2020 states. North Carolina is set to gain 1. Florida is set to gain 2. The Sun Belt region is overall, mostly at least, growing in terms of electoral representation, at least the swing states. Alabama is losing 1. But overall, these states are expecting to gain an electoral vote, which means that if the Democrats are able to tap into these bases and win them, that's a few more electoral votes to put them over 270 or at 270 to win the election. And where are these new electoral votes coming from? Well, they're coming from the Rust Belt region, where the Democratic Party previously used as their main strategy. And not to say, I'm going to say this multiple times, they should not neglect it the same way Hillary Clinton did. They should still absolutely focus on it, but their priority should be the Sun Belt. It should no longer be just the Rust Belt. Biden's campaign strategy worked because this was 4 years ago, if we're talking about 2024. Right? This year was a good balance for Joe Biden. But in future elections where minority representation will be much higher in some of these states, the main strategy should not be just trying to win over the white working class, but rather minority voters and return them to 2012, 2016 numbers. because Hillary Clinton did better amongst minorities than Joe Biden. But Joe Biden was able to win over more white voters than Hillary Clinton. They make up a larger portion of the electorate, but as the gap starts narrowing, well, the Democrats should start to return to how they previously were able to appeal on top of appealing to white voters, because that's when you actually enter into landslide territory for the Democrats. But what you're looking at is a new type of region of the country that is gaining in terms of electoral presence. And I had mentioned this. I said, which region of the country is losing electoral votes to make up for this? Well, the Rust Belt. Michigan is set to drop down to 15. Minnesota is set down to drop down to 9. Pennsylvania is expected to drop down to 19. Even some other northeastern states are making up for the loss down in the South. New York is expected to drop to 28. Rhode Island is expected to drop to 3. So some of these regions, which are traditionally, Democratic areas, or at least were before, including the Rust Belt, are losing electoral votes, and it's going to the Sun Belt. So as Republicans continue to win in some of these states, the Democratic Party is going to be giving up new electoral votes that could be added into their column. 38 is a lot. It was 34 when Obama was first elected. Now it's set to be 41. It's possible it could reach California-type numbers in just a few decades, which means this incentivizes Democrats to start working in there now, starting to lay out the foundation the same way Stacey Abrams was able to in Georgia, and actually win this state on the presidential level. Georgia and Arizona shocked the nation when a number of other states ended up being Trump states again. North Carolina was closer than Georgia and Arizona. Actually, North Carolina was narrowly ahead of Arizona, but North Carolina was closer than Georgia in 2016. But North Carolina didn't flip. Florida was closer than Arizona and Georgia, but Florida didn't flip. Looking at the swings from 2016 to 2020, North Carolina and Florida had smaller swings than Georgia, than Arizona, than Texas even, which I think is pretty interesting. So I think the Democratic Party should really try to focus on Texas and North Carolina and Florida the same way they did in Georgia. The Democrats have always been invested in Florida, always been invested in North Carolina because of its swing state status. But there are other states in this region that the Democratic Party needs to solidify the same way they were able to with Colorado, the same way they were able to with New Mexico and Virginia. That way in future elections, these states can be leaner likely and they can start expanding their map. The Democrats have been doing it for a few decades now, making inroads in some of these states, sped up by Obama, then sped up again by Biden, largely also to do with Donald Trump's push away from the suburban region, which has really put a bad taste in the mouth for those voters there for the Republican Party. But I think the Democratic Party absolutely should be focusing on the Sun Belt for future strategies in order to win elections, because it's not just the presidential margin. These states could equally match up to the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania senators. That's 6 senators in total. Let's say the GOP wins all of them. Well, the Democrats now have 4 in Arizona. They could get 2 in Texas. They could get 2 in North Carolina. They could get 2 in Florida, and then it would completely offset and actually benefit them from their loss in the Sun Belt. In the Rust Belt. Too many belts. But overall, not to say that the Democrats should give up the Rust Belt. I'm not saying that whatsoever, but I think their new winning strategy lies in the Sun Belt for decades to come, because of its population growth, because of its newfound, acceptance of Democratic ideals. They're no longer too hostile to Democratic candidates. And what we saw from this election, from 2016, from 2012, is that these states have consistently shifted to the left from the last time a Republican won before Donald Trump. And there is a reason for that. The Republican Party is losing support amongst this region, and minority population is growing in terms of raw percentage, which in turn benefits the Democratic Party. So I think for a number of reasons, including those I mentioned, the Democratic Party should be focusing heavily on the Sun Belt because it is one of their strategies moving forward, and probably their best winning strategy moving forward. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my post-2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.